My name is Grace Yuan. I'm a partner at KML Gates. We're delighted that you're here with us today. We are an international law firm with offices in 44 offices on 5 continents. We are positioned at key intersections of the global economy. What I'd like to do before we get started is share with you some examples of what it means to green in our economy. Amalia? Oh, well, we have slides, but I guess, can you page Amalia bulletin? But we will go ahead and move forward. How many of you have visited a part of the mountains that sound green? Okay, even if you didn't raise your hands, if you live in the Seattle area, you have seen it because it's a 100-mile corridor from here to Ellensburg. 1.5 million acres of public and private lands. It's an amazing project, and one of our main partners, Jim Ellis, this was his vision, and he and many other partners have volunteered their time to serve on board, serve as president, to make that come about. A second example is from our Washington, D.C. office. Over a period of 15 years, their volunteer efforts have generated more than $4 billion in funding for water advocates and follow-on organizations. Basically, these appropriations have been directed towards first-time, sustained access to safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene in developing countries. So again, the number is $4 billion. Don't try to do that at home. Some of you know that I've been working with K-12 public schools for almost 30 years. We've been implementing, for example, the high-performance schools, which is our form of the LEED standards. We work with Lake Washington School District, which is now the largest generator of solar energy of any public school district in Washington State. They also built the first building for school with a green roof among the public schools in Washington. So part of my work with them has involved acquiring school sites in 2 master plan communities called Redmond and Redmond Ridge East. And Amalia, can I have my slides?
They're working on it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Again, we're going to keep moving on. Okay, so without the slides, I'm still going to tell you the story of how exciting my practice is. So we acquired a site from the developer, and we leased it back to them thinking that they were going to put model units on the property, and people could see what the model units look like. We went to visit the site, and it ended up that they had dug a pit in the playfield portion of the school property because apparently we had really good soil on our property, and the soils on the properties where the roads system was going to be built in the master plan community was bad soil. So they were going to take our good soil away and dump their bad soil in ours. And the message they kept telling me was, well, it's only elementary school kids. It's only playfields. And I kept thinking, well, it's fine as long as it's not your kids tripping over uneven dirt on the soccer fields. So the visual that you will have to imagine, because it's being worked on, is it really did look like a mining pit. So long story short, we sued the developer, and they eventually conveyed to us another piece of property. The final example I want to talk about is Franklin Pierce School District. This is a small school district near Tacoma that I've represented for a long, long time. There's 73% free and reduced lunch. So you can imagine the level of challenges and poverty issues that they're working on in that community. So you would think that this would not be the ideal place to see innovation. Well, in fact, Franklin Pierce this school year, rolled out the first electric school bus. They provided an example for so many other districts. Now, it's scary, it's hard, but there's nothing about this enterprise that is easy. So I commend them. They're in the process. They've received grant funding for 3 other electric buses. I have a question, and this is not a trick question. Who can tell me what an electric school bus will do for our students? Oh, come on. You were so polite in responding to my good morning. Okay, yes?
Kids don't have to breathe stinky diesel fumes.
That's a good answer. Okay, any others?
It'll inspire them to start thinking of other options.
Absolutely. All excellent.
They learn that all electric is practical.
Agreed? Assuming that this district is very flat. So it works in this district. Okay, so this is an unintended consequence of the electric bus. When I got on it for the first time, I was shocked, and I couldn't figure out why I was shocked. The reason I was shocked because it was so quiet. Okay, so who's been on a school field trip recently on one of the traditional buses? Right? You know what you're doing. I mean, I supervised a lot of those field trips when my son was in elementary school. You're yelling over the sound of the diesel engine. So really, a unintended practical outcome of the electric bus is we're actually getting better behavior from students on these buses. So those are several examples of green in our DNA. I would like to turn to introducing our guest, Robert Woodrell.
Grace Simon.
Oh, you're doing. Sorry. Guess what? I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. I wanted to give a special thank you to Grace and all of you at K&L Gates for hosting us today. I'm Kristen Daly. I'm the Executive Director of Global Washington, one of the hosts today. And the other host is the Seattle Foundation. And I wanted to do a special shout out to Fidelma McGinn, who's actually wearing two great hats. A lot of you know Fidelma because she is a leader in our community. Oh, do I get Grace's? We can take a moment. You remember what Grace said? It's great. Do you have a school bus?
Yep.
I think we're done. I'm glad you could say the words since I'm not going to follow this slide. So thank you, Fidelma. She's wearing her hats as for the Seattle Foundation, but also for the Irish community here. So she's such a rock star in our Irish community. So thank you so much. I also wanted to recognize a few of the other partners here today. This event sold out within a matter of days. There's so much pent-up demand and interest in hearing from Mary Robinson. So I wanted to thank a few of our promotional partners: Climate Solutions, Landesa, Notre Dame Alumni Club, the Irish Heritage Club, and the Irish Network. So thank you all. So real briefly, Global Washington is a network of 165 nonprofit and for-profit organizations that have a presence here in Washington State and work to improve lives in developing countries in the Global South. So we also advise philanthropists and corporate philanthropists, and one day one of the corporate members asked me that they wanted to get involved in climate change and grant making to the Global South for climate change. And they said, what are the nonprofits that work in climate change? And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, you know what? In the Global South, many people don't call it climate change. They look at the impact of climate change. They look at drought. They look at flooding. They look at the loss of income and the mass migration caused by climate change in the Global South. So that's what the reality is for many of the Global Washington members that have been working on this issue, the mitigation and adaptation of climate change in the Global South. It's a stark, devastating new reality for so many people in the Global South. So I am honored to have Mary Robinson here as a champion to give voice to those in the Global South that are often not at the table. So without further ado, I'd first like to introduce Robert O'Driscoll. You'll hear from Mary Robinson a little bit later, and then you will also have your opportunity to ask questions via note cards. So start thinking of your questions now, and we'll collect the note cards later on. So Robert O'Driscoll is the Consul General of Ireland for the Western United States, and he's based in San Francisco. Robert was born in Dublin and has a very impressive career as an Irish diplomat. His work included foreign affairs, trade, international security, and EU matters. He served as Ireland's permanent representative to the EU in Brussels in 2012, and prior to that, he was deputy head of mission in Ireland's embassy to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia. We're so fortunate to have Robert here on the West Coast in our community and here in Seattle today. So Robert.
Så det blir en av Kristen. Horja, Inusla, distinguished guests, friends, my name is Robert O'Driscoll. I'm Ireland's Consul General here in San Francisco, and it's always a pleasure to be in the Emerald City. There's a few places on the West Coast where I feel more at home. Before we begin, I just want to thank both Kristen and Fidelma. About a year ago was the first time I reached out to Kristen. We had our development minister coming, and I wanted to have wanted him to come and meet with the group here, and the warmth of that engagement was so positive for us that we kept coming back. I'm not sure if Kristen's happy with that or not. I hope she is. But over the last year, we've had a really rich engagement with Kristen and Fidelma, and it's really made clear to me about some of the values in Seattle that I hadn't fully realised when I first came here, and how Seattleites, like Ireland, were not exactly in the centre of the world. We've kind of had to shape our world to our own circumstances. But like Ireland, Seattle people realise that they've been given this gift of incredibly innovative culture and society here, and what they want to do is to give those gifts to the world, to take on some of the biggest challenges that the world faces. I think it's something that Seattleites and people from Washington State should be very, very proud of. So to Global Washington and the Seattle Foundation, thank you very much for everything today. Thank you very much. I also want to recognise two people here today, our Honorary Consul, John Keane, who everyone here in the Irish you know very well. John's long-serving and long-suffering, but has been our most remarkable servant to Ireland in his role. And also to Mark Ferguson, who is here this week. He's the Chief Government Advisor to the Irish Government on scientific issues. So we just give them a round of applause. So to our guest of honour today, Mary Robinson. So I am 37 years old. So when Mary Robinson was elected president, I was 8. And I was not meet you. Just to say that for me, everyone of my generation and those above me, those who are older than me, you've been a dominant figure in our lives, a figure of remarkable transformation. I think that if you look at the modern Ireland of today, Ireland where we take for granted that there is marriage equality, that there is a liberalisation of our reproductive rights laws, that people can even access condoms, very small things. That Ireland today, or 17% of the people are born from outside of Ireland. It's become this incredibly welcoming home to people from all different cultures, shapes and sizes. And that is an Ireland that did not exist when Mary Robinson entered the Senate, our Senate, in the 1960s, but it is a world and a country that she helped create and helped shape. Looking back at it now, it seems clear that her election as president in 1990 was a precursor to what was to be almost 3 decades of modernisation and increasingly progressive policies in Ireland. And I think it's fair to say that your role as president, not only in the activist role that you played, going over the world, putting a spotlight on challenging issues, really changed how we perceive ourselves, and for Irish people all over the world, gave us great pride. So that I think goes without saying. I think given that we're here in Seattle, where 10% of everyone in the Seattle metro area identifies as Irish American, with a fair few Irish born people here as well, I think you're moved to put a candle in the window of our Sutron in remembrance of those people who had to leave Ireland for a better life. I think it still resonates so strongly with many of us. And certainly many people have said to me when they visited Ireland that is a symbol of remembrance, a symbol of connectivity, which still rings very true and very warmly in our hearts. But Mary Robinson was too great for Ireland. And we had to share her with the world. Selfishly, we didn't want to, I'm sure, but we had to. And ever since, her first role, of course, was as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Since then, she has been the Special Envoy for Climate Change, Special Envoy to El Niño and the Climate, Special Representative for the Great Lakes, and of course, her current role as Chair of the Elders, bringing her wisdom and her values to every corner of the world. It is no surprise to me to learn that she's obviously which was given by President Obama in 2009, the US Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest civilian honors this state can give. Entirely justified. You know, since we're in, I've heard Mary described as being someone who broke the mold. That to me doesn't ring true in somewhere that's in us here. I think that while the rest of the world is busy with molds, Mary has been digital printing. Someone who has really reimagined the world in her own way. But I think it's climate justice where she brought all the leadership experience that she had, all the knowledge that she had to bear. And I remember, for me, the first experience I had about climate justice was back during our presidency of the European Union in 2013, when we ran a large conference in Dublin Castle between Ireland as president and Mary Robinson and your foundation. I didn't fully understand, I must admit beforehand, what climate justice meant. And when we met with Mary Robinson Foundation, said, well, we're going to bring all these people from those countries most affected by climate change into a room with very senior political leaders from all over the world. And I was just like, yeah, okay, let's see what happens, let's see this works. But it was remarkable, because when you start getting the voices of those most affected, when they can explain in a day-to-day detail on what the impact of the climate challenges are that they're experiencing, it makes very real to policymakers the challenges these people face. And I think it stimulates much greater action. The format, the voices, they're so important. And I think it's fair to say that while it was probably not a fully understood topic, concept in 2013, it most certainly is now. And that's down to you and down to your work. In conclusion, I just want to say this has been a very, very busy week for Mary Robinson. She was in New York earlier this week at the UN, where she launched a programme by the Irish government. It's a call for action, a global call to action for the education of adolescent girls. It's called the Drive for Five. She was there with Bono. I know who the rock star is in that relationship. She's here with us today. And tomorrow she will speak along with Science Foundation Ireland and ICRAG, one of Ireland's research centres, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science on the theme Climate Change Mitigation, the Role of Industry and the Private Sector. We are so lucky though that she's taken time here this morning to do this event. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mary Robinson.
Robert, and happy Valentine's Day, happy Fridays for Future. This is one of the days where young people have come out in huge numbers, particularly in Europe, but actually all over the world. And that has been really important for me when I reflect on how the concept of climate justice has gone from being something of a taboo subject when I established the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice in 2010 to becoming really an approach to climate decision-making and action that's people-centered, that's rights-informed and fair. And I learned in my work in Africa, when I had finished my term as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I felt we didn't pay enough attention to the rights that really matter if you don't have them. Rights to food and water, health, education, shelter. So I formed a small organization called Realizing Rights, which was a kind of double meaning that everyone in the world should realize they had rights, and those with power should realize those rights by implementing them. So that was what Realizing Rights was about. And we worked in African countries starting in 2003. I hadn't made any speech as High Commissioner for Human Rights about climate change because another part of the UN was dealing with it. I was in a silo, big silo, but nonetheless a silo. I had not made the connection between the negative impacts of climate change undermining human rights. And it came to me very clearly working in these African countries because people kept saying, you know, things are so much worse now. What was making it worse? Unpredictability. In Liberia, I would have breakfast with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I knew her before she became president of Liberia, and I was helping her and working a bit in Liberia with my colleagues. And we would have breakfast together. And she would say, you know, Mary, when I was growing up, we had 2 rainy seasons that were predictable to a day. Now, I don't know when the rainy season will come. I don't know for how long. I can't even mend my roads. So that was the top-down. But it was the bottom-up impact that was really telling. And in my book on climate justice, I tell an early story of sitting with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was chair of the elders at that time. I was just a backwards, it's not backwards, what's the word? Backbencher elder. And we listened to 5 farmers from Africa, and 4 of them were women, which is very true. One of them was a rooibos farmer from South Africa itself, who came with her husband, and she looked 20 years older than she actually was, because she was so stressed by the drought which had destroyed her rooibos farm. There was one man from Kenya who was a pastoralist, and he was down to his last 20 goats of a herd of 200. And you could tell he didn't believe he'd have any goats, by the end of a year or so. We had terrible stories from Mali and Malawi, but the one that struck me and stayed with me is actually the first story in the book. It was Constance O'Kellet from Uganda. And I watched Archbishop Tutu, who had been very upbeat at the beginning, begin to slump with these stories. He was really down because he was listening and taking in what they were saying. And I decided to kind of challenge these 5 farmers on the basis of my extreme experience of being able to go out on long calls with my doctor father in County Mayo in Ireland. You had to go for long distances because there were very few doctors. And he loved the small farmers in the west of Ireland. But the one thing he would say to me is, Mary, the one thing about farmers is they always complain about the weather. Always complain about the weather. So I decided to challenge these 5 African farmers. And I said, is that what you're doing? You're just complaining because the weather is worse than it. And I remember Constance stood up. She's a very tall woman. She told me afterwards, I always stand up when I have something important to say. But she stood up and she looked at me and she said, this is outside our experience. And I'll never forget her saying that. And I thought to myself, what is the experience in an African village? From the grandparent talking to the grandchild who talks to his or her grandchild. It's about 200 years. And, outside our experience. And Constance has become a very important voice as a climate-wise woman. She comes to COPs, conferences on climate, as part of the Irish delegation from Uganda, which allows her to have her voice inside the zone. Whereas, for those of you who've been to conferences on climate, you have the delegate zone, which is boring as hell because they talk this technical, awful language, and then you have the vibrancy of the NGOs, the women's groups, the indigenous groups, etc., but they don't have a voice heard, and it's important that they really do. And so the injustice that I talked about over the years was the problem of the poorest countries, the small island states that would go underwater, the poor communities even in rich countries, and 2 of the stories are deliberately from the United States in the book on climate justice, so that they can illustrate aspects of it. I do joke a little bit that there are 11 stories in the book, and 9 of them are about women, but there are 2 good men as well. And they're chosen to create a kind of empathy and understanding. But I had spoken as a grandmother. I'm a fortunate Irish grandmother. I have 6 grandchildren. I now call myself an angry granny because in September 2014, just before the first of these climate summits that Ban Ki-moon was organizing, a year before Paris, there was a huge march in New York, which a number of you will remember. 400,000 people got out and marched. And I was marching with Group Brundtland as an elder, and people wanted to join us because we were elders. And there were so many people, we didn't actually march. We more shuffled along, a few inches at a time. And I saw a group of women join us from a side road, and they had a banner which said, "Angry Grannies," and I thought, that's what I wanted. I tried to get over to them, but I couldn't quite make it. And I did talk as a grandmother, and the elders did some intergenerational work, but it was the children who have made us to understand the intergenerational injustice. And the importance of that is that affects everyone. When I was talking about small island states and least developed countries, people say, yeah, but implicitly they were saying, that's not me. but good that you care about it, but, you know, but intergenerational justice is all of us. It's everyone. And, you know, the fact that young people, as they have today, are striking for Fridays for Future is extraordinarily important. I sat in the General Assembly last September when Greta Thunberg, in an angry voice, you remember that angry voice that was broadcast around the world, she said, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough, that the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight." And I have to say, sitting in that General Assembly, I felt tears in my eyes. She was 16 at the time. That a child had to come and, in a stressed voice, address, and you saw the embarrassment of the shifting on the floor. And what I want to say is, the good news is that we have at last woken up, and it's not too late because of the changes that are taking place, in particular in renewable energy becoming so competitive. And I want to make a very strong point that we don't need to reinvent wheels. We actually have the frameworks to deal with this issue. And I was personally able to witness the negotiation of those frameworks in 2015, starting with the 2030 agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I wear this badge, there it is, partly because it's the only badge in the UN I've ever liked, and it goes with everything. So it's important because the 2030 agenda was a remarkable achievement of 193 countries, negotiating about sustainable development, realizing no country was actually developing sustainably, and therefore we had to do something about it. We needed to move on from the Millennium Development Goals, which was only for developing countries, to a framework for the whole world. And we got lovely language of human rights, gender equality, Goal 5, but also leave no one behind. Why did we get that? Because it was voluntary. Countries would be able to pick and choose. And then we had the treaty, the Paris Agreement, which got weaker until the small island states and the poorest countries insisted on getting 1.5 referenced in the text. So the goal became the goal of being well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degrees. And it was interesting that the scientists had not actually studied that. So the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists, and then they came out with that important report in October 2018, which said, actually there's a big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. In that band of time, bad things happen. The coral reefs will probably more or less disappear. The Arctic ice will probably more or less disappear. And the permafrost, which has already begun to melt, will melt hugely and throw out not just carbon, but also methane, which is very dangerous. And so their recommendation was that we have to stay at 1.5 degrees, the whole world. So that's stricter than the Paris goal itself, as interpreted by the science. And they said, it is doable if we have the political will, but what we have to do initially to get on track by 2030 is to reduce by global carbon emissions by 45%. It's doable if we have the political will. And the point is, how do we get that political will? I think we get it by insisting that what was thought to be voluntary in the Sustainable Development Goals was thought to be weak in enforcement in Paris becomes imperative. We have to actually take seriously and implement these agendas. And we need a bottom-up movement of climate justice, pressurizing governments, and we need a top-down pressure of investment on the right side, investment to move to clean energy, business giving leadership, talking to government, please give us the regulations and the fairness, don't let the outriders give us a price on carbon, give us the ways in which we can move forward because we're ready to move forward. A lot of business is saying that. A lot of cities are doing a lot, including, happily, in this country, states and cities, despite bad leadership at the federal level. I don't want to go there. Anyway, so I'll just finish by saying, I think it's useful if every one of us would think of the 3 steps that we could take. And I'm sure many of you in this hall have taken at least one of these steps. And that is to make the climate crisis and it is a crisis, it is an emergency. Make the climate crisis personal in your life and do something to show that you've done that. I've become a pescatarian. I don't eat meat anymore. My beloved husband has become a flexitarian. He eats much less meat. The second step is to get angry and get active. Get angry with those who have more responsibility and are not doing enough. More responsibility at government level, but also at state level, at city level, at whatever level, in business, fossil fuel industry, agribusiness, etc. And to support those, get active in supporting those who are taking action, many of them represented here in this room in your organizations. And the third step, and I think this is the one we don't pay enough attention to, is we have to imagine this future that we need to be hurrying towards. Because if we're going to get there, we have to motivate people to take these steps that we need to take. And what's that future going to be like? It's a bit like the question about the electric bus. It's going to be a very healthy future. It's going to be a relationships future because we will have circular economies. We'll have things that last. We'll have slow food, slow fashion, recycling, using, and that means we'll have relationships in a new way. We'll also have to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and get electricity to the billion people who never switch the switch, because all the gadgets are there. The systems, the solar panels, the clean cook stoves, we just haven't made it a priority, a moonshot priority, to get to these people and change their lives and help them to come out of their poverty. All of that is the opportunity of this climate crisis. And it's that opportunity that I think we need to talk about, because we need to help people to come out of their climate anxiety and know that the scientists have told us it's doable if we have the political will. So I have this great imaginative idea of a worldwide climate justice movement, bottom up, the business and investment top down, and people like Mark Carney, very valuable in their advice and investing. And then in the middle you have the governments being squeezed. And the truth is, they need a lot of squeezing, because that's where the problem is. That's actually the only place where the problem is. So now, I've thrown a few things in the air. I'm going to have a great conversation, and I hope also that we have time for questions from you at the end. But it's great to talk to an audience that's already so engaged as many of you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your inspiring remarks and for your fabulous book. If you haven't already read it, it is absolutely a must-read. I'm Carmen Gonzalez. I'm a law professor at Seattle University School of Law, where I've been teaching for 20 years. And my area of expertise is environmental law, environmental justice, and climate law. And I have to say that your book on climate justice is something that I'm adding to my curriculum, because what I struggle with is feeling hope given how serious the problem is and how urgent the action is. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I will join you. And then after the questions and answers, you will all have the opportunity to ask your questions, write them down on your note cards, and they will be given to me, and I will pose them. So I want to begin with some of the issues that you just raised. You talked about intergenerational justice.
Yeah.
Very often when people talk about climate change, they don't talk about climate justice and the disproportionate impact that climate change is having on the most vulnerable and on future generations. As an environmental law professor, I want to follow up on your remark about the frameworks that already exist to deal with climate change, especially the principle of common and differentiated responsibilities. What is the obligation of affluent countries to those who are bearing the cost of climate change disproportionately?
It's a very good question, because common but differentiated responsibility was a much stronger principle under the Kyoto Protocol. It got kind of softened by the whole process of going to Paris, where every country was to make a commitment to the nationally determined contribution, the NDCs. And now, 2020 is a very important year, because governments have to increase the ambition in their NDCs. But we've almost lost the reality that governments need to, the governments of countries that have been historic emitters and are still major emitters in our world today, the industrialized countries, have to do far more. and have to give far more leadership. And it's there's so much injustice in dealing with climate change. There's the injustice that developing countries have to develop. They have to take their people out of poverty. They're finding oil, gas, and coal. They want to use it, and we're saying no, you can't. But in saying no, you can't, we're not doing what we should be doing. We should have gone out of coal, and coal in particular, and oil and gas much, much more rapidly, and then developed, as we are doing, but not doing fast enough, the battery retention, the innovations, the hybrid that's coming on stream, etc., to ensure that developing countries will be able to develop, but hopefully do it in a more transformative way, like they leapfrogged with the mobile phone. I mean, that's a great example, that literally it transformed so many lives, because they didn't have landlines, they went straight to the mobile phone.
In your book, one of the things that you talk about in your book that I thought was very inspiring is, on the one hand, women throughout the world are disproportionately burdened by climate change, but women are also taking a significant leadership role at the grassroots level in terms of finding solutions and addressing the problem. Could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yes, if I may, I'll also promote another thing that I've done, which is my podcast. How many people have listened to the podcast? Oh, I see some hands going up. Oh, good. I didn't know what a podcast was about 2.5 years ago, but I was persuaded it was a good way to communicate a message. I wanted to communicate. And I was lucky enough to get a partner in crime, if I can put it that way, a much younger Irish person, a bit like the Irish Consul General. She was 8 when I was elected president. She's a very successful comedian based in New York City, Maeve Higgins. And Maeve and myself have this podcast called Mothers of Invention. And our byline is that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. I never bothers to explain, but I take the trouble to say that man-made is generic, we're all responsible, and a feminist solution definitely includes men. And actually, the feminist solution, interestingly, is the 2030 Agenda. It's the 2030 Agenda of problem solving, of addressing, and of leaving no one behind, and of having gender equality in a very central way. That is the feminist agenda when you think about it. But to your question, I was very shocked when I attended my first climate conference, which was Copenhagen. It was so technical and boring, and nothing about people. And then I looked at the convention, the climate convention. There is one phrase, worrying about current and future generations of humankind. That's the only reference to people in the convention. So, the scientists have done their bit, the environment, but they've skewed it away from people and from the injustices that we've been looking at. And so, after Copenhagen, we formed in Cancun a group of women leaders on gender and climate. And they were women ministers, women heads of agencies, and a few male ministers. But we kept the men in a minority, because this was the women leaders on gender and climate. By Durban, we had already decided, the next conference in Durban, that we would try to get an old decision on gender parity of delegations, which was weak and wasn't being implemented. To get that reinforced, which we managed to do in Durban. Christiana Figueres calls it the Durban miracle, I think. But, and then we helped the big constituency of women to get the gender action plan, which is so important. Because of the gender dimensions, when you undermine poverty and undermine livelihoods, who has to still put food on the table? Who has to go further in the drought for water, further for firewood? I mean, the gender dimensions are huge. And then the group of women, the women leaders on gender and climate, took on another very important step, which was realizing we're the heads of our delegations. We determine who's in the delegation. And that's when they began, before Paris, to have indigenous women, grassroots women, young women in their delegations. And then we had the voices in the zone. Whereas before, there was that difference, which many of you who've been to climate conferences will know. You've got the official zones where delegates are, and then often quite far away, you have the vibrant place where all the civil society meet. And there's no meeting of minds. They can't impact. But if you can get the voices in at the table, it makes such a difference. And I've seen it, witnessed it over and over again. It actually, most of these delegates live in cities, are technicians, care about guarding any change that they are trying to prevent of one sort or another. And suddenly, it's blown wide open by the reality of frontline voices saying, this is what we're coping with, this is unfair, this is what we're trying to do, we need more support for adaptation, for example.
Following up on the impact on frontline communities, all over the world, climate change is displacing people. It's displacing people within the countries where they live. It's displacing people across borders. We saw displacement in the United States with Hurricane Katrina. We're now seeing a large influx of migrants and refugees from Central America who are fleeing poverty, they're fleeing conflict, but they're also fleeing recurrent droughts. Unfortunately, there is no legal framework to address climate displaced persons. The 1951 Refugee Convention does not cover that.
Yeah.
And we're seeing what is happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, the brutal, the inhumane response. What is the responsibility of especially affluent countries that disproportionately contribute to climate change when it comes to making a space for climate displaced persons and addressing their plight, both preventing it and addressing it?
Certainly, I very much agree with you. Climate displacement is a very, very real issue now. Climate may not be the only driver of people having to move, but it's becoming more and more of a major one. And they have no rights as such, climate displaced people. They have some recognition now in the Global Compact on migration. My foundation worked very hard to get at least that thing. The first time I heard somebody talk about working on climate displacement, she's not a story in the book, but she could well be, Ursula Rakova, was moving her population of about 1,500 people from her Catherine Island, which they could no longer live in because of the rising seawater, to Papua New Guinea. The same sovereignty, no change in sovereignty, but miles and miles away. So they would bring small groups, and they bought land, but then they had to create relations between neighbours, and then more would come, and the process is still going on. And she says, and whenever she says this, I just feel the sadness in her eyes. She says, but there's nothing we can do about the fact that we have to move from the land of the bones of our ancestors. And that's the indigenous, that's such a hurt, really hard. Now, I was in Honduras in my second mandate for climate in 2016 on El Niño and climate. I went to Honduras because it's a dry corridor in Central America, very affected when there's an El Niño. And the drought was unbelievable. I sat under a tree listening to a group of women from various villages around, brought together by a women's organization I'd never met before, but they kindly did this as part of my visit there. And the pain in their faces when they said, we have no water, how do you live without water? And then they said, all the young are moving to the United States. They're being pushed back and they're going again. So that was a very clear indication to me of what was the main driver at that time, and I think since. And just the inhumanity of it somehow. I do believe that richer countries have to take their responsibility, and we've had one breakthrough in the Human Rights Committee. Very recently, the UN Human Rights Committee had a case of a man from Kiribati, which is the small atolls. In fact, one of the stories in the book is the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tom, who became a good friend. And I told his story because I never, as President of Ireland, had to go back to my country and tell the people they had no future. But that's what he did with Kiribati. So Kiribati is small atolls, and the complainant in this case lived in one of the very small ones which had gone under, moved to a bigger atoll, but it was overcrowded, and he felt he couldn't make a living there. So he moved to New Zealand, which wanted to evict him because he didn't have a right to be there. And he claimed before the Human Rights Committee that climate change had made it impossible for him to live. And the important thing is the Human Rights Committee upheld the principle that if climate change makes it impossible for you to live somewhere, you have a right to move. That's the first time we've seen that. Unfortunately for the man, his evidence base didn't stand up. he couldn't establish conclusively that he couldn't live in Kiribati. But I thought that was a really important first little step, you know, and we need much more litigation generally. Litigation is very important because it's disruptive. We saw the Urgenda case in the Netherlands, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court there, and that required the government of the Netherlands to reduce emissions more than they had intended. We need smart people. I'm in a law firm, you know, smart actions, and many more of them.
Scientists tell us that in order to address climate change, about 90% of the fossil fuel reserves have to be kept in the ground and not burned. How do we do that? Do we do it through litigation against the fossil fuel industry? Do we do it through divestment and investor pressure? Do we do it through a treaty phasing out fossil fuels? And more importantly, there are already communities on the ground who are protecting their water and their land from fossil fuel development. We saw it with the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in the United States. How do we support those frontline communities that are doing so much not only to protect their lands, but to avert climate change overall?
It's a very big issue. The scientists have told us, they told us we had 12 years in October 2018 to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030. Carbon emissions went up in they went up 4% since Paris. Actually, this year, I think for the first time, they may not have gone up for 2019. I just saw some analysis of that. Maybe somebody in the audience knows more than I do about just exactly, but we're certainly not reducing by 45%. We're not on track for that. I had a privilege of being invited to the Vatican for the second convening by Pope Francis of the heads of oil and gas companies and the heads of the investments companies that invest in oil and gas, not coal, oil and gas. ExxonMobil were there, Headman, BP, Total, Shell, all of them, and the investors were there. The previous year, they had met in the Vatican, I wasn't there, and it hadn't been a success. The Pope had not been pleased. He came, read out in Italian, a very tough statement, and then left with no photographs, which for many of them was what they'd come for, basically. And, so this year, Notre Dame had worked during the year and had worked out weak texts on carbon pricing and on carbon risk disclosure. And after some discussion where the statements became even weaker, and I was frustrated, but I kept my mouth shut because the important thing was get these guys to sign up. They did all sign up, and they were so weak it just didn't seem to make any difference. But that was the first time I really understood that these heads of oil and gas companies have no intention of voluntarily changing. And the reason is very simple. Fossil fuel makes you billions. Clean energy makes you millions. So how do you go from billions to billions without disruption? That's my conclusion. We actually need all kinds of disruption. We need the litigation disruption, and there are a lot of cases now against fossil fuel companies or against governments that haven't yet come to hearing, but hopefully will over the next year or two. We need shareholders to raise this issue in meetings. We need things like Maeve Higgins, my co-podcaster. She rang her bank, Chase Bank, she was very invested in fossil fuel. It's a very funny thing. The woman that she talked to said she couldn't advise her on how to withdraw her money. Maeve said, I can't invest in a bank that's invested in fossil fuel. And then Maeve said, well, I'm ringing you from New York. Where are you? And the woman said, I'm in the Philippines. And Maeve said, oh, the Philippines. It must be very affected by climate. And for the next 10 minutes, the woman talks about how badly affected. So it's bad publicity for Chase Bank, if you like. We need, probably the most effective is the one that I was talking about, the top-down pressure is the investment pressure and the business pressure. Good business leaders. I'm linked to the B team of business leaders. The current chair is Paul Pullman, formerly of Unilever, and the deputy chair is Sharon Burrow, the head of the ITUC, the most senior trade union woman in the world. And they work together with other companies. Before Paris, in January before Paris, I was there in Davos, The B-team companies made a commitment to be zero greenhouse gas emissions in their companies and in their supply chain by 2050, and to do it the climate justice way is just transition. And I think we need to talk about just transition at some point.
That is exactly my next question. The issue of just transition arises in many different contexts. One of the contexts in which it's often raised in the United States is you have coal miners and coal mining communities who for decades, if not centuries, have borne all of the negative consequences of coal production. Contaminated air, contaminated water, high levels of black lung disease. And now as we transition away from coal, not only are they bearing the lingering consequences of all of that, but now they're unemployed as well. That's one form of injustice and transition. Another issue that is related is how we ensure that the transition to renewable energy is done in a just manner. In your book, you talk about a very successful forest conservation project in Vietnam, but there are also many examples of unsuccessful forest conservation projects where indigenous peoples have been kicked out off their lands in the name of protecting the forest. We also have examples of biofuels plantations that have resulted in the eviction of small farmers from their lands. We have windmills that have been constructed on indigenous lands without free, prior, and informed consent. How do we ensure justice in the green energy transition for the new developments and also for those who have been in the fossil fuel industry?
I think this is possibly the most important question now, as we have to move and move much more rapidly. We have to bring people with us, especially those who feel they're not understood, they're not included, they're not part of the solution going forward. And I have to remember on the podcast, Mothers of Invention, we try to have climate voices from the South, the global South. So when the report, the scientific report of the IPCC in October 2018 came out, we wanted to get a woman from the South, a scientist, and we got a very good scientist from Botswana, Pauline Due, and we had to talk to her on the phone. She was in Botswana, but she'd been at the conference in Korea that had concluded this report, very highly respected scientist. And she explained the report very clearly to our listeners, and then she said, I have such empathy for developed countries. And I've never heard this before. I have such empathy for developed countries. They have these large grids. They have so many workers in the coal, oil, and gas. I have such empathy. Now here in Botswana, we have to get clean energy to more remote areas. But it's doable. We're working at it. I have such empathy for developed countries. And she's right. Because we haven't begun to really figure this out properly. Yes, in Europe we're beginning to. The European Union, as you probably know, have committed to a Green New Deal with a climate justice fund, big climate justice fund. Spain has put up a fund because it worked with Sharon Burrow and the trade union movement in Spain. Big fund to get out of coal. Probably none of these funds are big enough, but at least they're understanding the problem. And then the other just transition is equally important that you referenced, to do things appropriately and fairly and properly. I have a good example, she's not in the book, a good friend of mine, she's a Maasai from Kenya, and on her land was built the biggest wind farm in Africa, spread out over that part of it, with no concern for the Maasai, no thought that they had land rights, and the wind energy was being channeled off and they weren't getting any. And, you know, she sort of said, I'm not against clean energy, but this is our land, we wouldn't be getting any of it. So there's a lot of top-down, big mega projects to get the clean energy, and a lot of them are not well thought through, not properly just transition, and not fair to the communities who are trying to protect their land and their water rights.
Which is related to one of the comments you made in the beginning about how the climate treaties are so technical and they ignore the human rights component, and the danger that we can replicate that same pattern in the transition to renewable energy, thinking of this as a technical problem rather than a question of justice, which your book beautifully highlights. I want to bring it back to the people in this room. It's very difficult, and I experience this as someone who teaches climate change law. It's such a huge problem that people become paralyzed. And when people become paralyzed, they do nothing. They become helpless. How do people stay engaged? How do you remain hopeful? And then very specifically, what do you have to say to the people in this room? The United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but how can Seattle's global community of businesses, nonprofits, and academic institutions prioritize climate justice in your work and move the ball forward?
Yeah, I think it's important for people outside the United States to realize that despite the fact that everybody knows that President Trump has committed to destroying the United States, and as I'm sure you know in this room, he can't do it technically until the 4th of November 2020, and we know when your election is. But people need to know outside the United States what is really going on at state level and city level here. I met your mayor, Mayor Durkin, yesterday briefly, the Irish connection, and we talked about climate. She referenced the fact that the city is part of C40, that they're doing all kinds of, she mentioned some of the efforts that are being made. I'm sure more could be done, but she had the commitment and understanding of it. And I'm very impressed with what states and cities and communities are doing, and I was particularly interested in the reference to what communities here in this audience are doing in developing countries, which is less common, so I'm really pleased about that. To be honest, I think it has to be talked about more. It has to be more visible outside the United States to counter the negative impacts of reducing the environmental regulations, things that are being done at the federal level, which everybody knows about, and they don't know enough about what's happening at that level. And on the hope side, I have my favorite story, so I might as well tell it now, which I do tell a lot, but I actually cleared it with the source of the story just about 2 weeks ago. I was with Archbishop Desmond Tutu in near Cape Town. He's become very frail, but his spirit and his humour is as good as ever, and we had a lovely meeting. And I told him that I'm always, very often tell this story to an audience, because I think it certainly helped me at the time, and I think it does help. Arch, as we learned to call him, Arch and myself were at a conference about 10 years ago in New York, which was organised by the UN Foundation. It was a social good conference. And social good conferences they involve young people who are supposed to be on their iPhones and their tablets, etc., to create a social media buzz. It was supposed to be trendy, in that language. Anyway, I think, but when Arch is in front of young people, he just expresses his love, throws up his arms in every direction. And we were being moderated by an American journalist. And she said very sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" He looked at her and he shook his head and he said, "No, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And that resonated very much with me because, first of all, it's a nice place to be, in a prison with like-minded, very nice people. But more importantly, if you're a prisoner of hope, then you take, there's more in this glass, but I haven't had time to drink it, but take that it's not half full, but there's a little bit in the bottom. That's what you work with. You work, and that's the stories in this book. The title, the subtitle of it is Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future. And most of the people in the book are fighting against something they were not responsible for, that completely buffeted them, that destroyed their livelihoods, and they're working for it back. So it's one of the most important things to have the energy. And I'll tell you again, because it sticks with me, I was in a moment of no hope recently in Washington, D.C. A stark moment of frightening gloom when I was with Ban Ki-moon, who's also an elder. Ban Ki-moon gave me 3 mandates for the Great Lakes in Africa, for climate change, for El Niño and climate, as my boss. And now he's my deputy. And he's so supportive as a man, as my deputy and the elders. And we were together with Governor Jerry Brown. I wondered what his role was, and I discovered he's chair of the atomic scientists. And it's the atomic scientists who determine. We were there for the doomsday clock towards the end of January. 2 years ago, it had moved in the wrong direction to 2 minutes to midnight. Would it move again? As we unveiled it, it moved to 100 seconds to midnight. The doomsday clock has been there since 1947, and this is the nearest, even in the Cold War, it never got that near. This is the nearest we've been, for three reasons: the nuclear issue going the wrong direction, agreements unraveling, weaponizing with hypersonic weapons, climate change, it's getting worse and we're not dealing with it enough, and the technologies, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence potentially having weapons of mass destruction under their control, no human control. It was really very interesting. Literally all the energy was out of the room. There was a lot of publicity for the event on the day of it. It was covered massively around the world. And 3 days later it was gone. Because it didn't somehow give people hope. It didn't give them a sense of being energized and I think that's the really important thing.
One of the things that I truly loved about your book is the sense of hope. The stories that you tell about people, communities on the front lines, working against all odds, and yet being incredibly creative and incredibly innovative. There's often a tendency in the climate regime to come up with top-down solutions, to not listen to the voices of people who are doing incredibly innovative things and who understand their reality and their environment better than someone in Geneva or New York possibly could. Could you tell us a couple of those stories that you tell in the book? Because they're really breathtaking.
But maybe I'll tell the two stories that are based in the United States. So that was a very deliberate choice. And the first one is a story of Sharon Henshaw. She described herself as living on the wrong side of the tracks, African American. And this brings in the race dimension, the fact that when you talk about the injustice of climate change, it's a cumulative injustice. It's racial injustice is part of it. But she was a very happy woman. She had her home and her salon in East Biloxi. And her salon was where women went to for their hair and their nails and their gossip. And she was happy about that until she was completely devastated by Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina. It wiped her home and her salon. She found herself in complete humiliation of deep poverty. She got a FEMA trailer eventually, and she began to become, as she said, an accidental activist, and to fight back and to try to motivate and mobilize and start planting, start getting mini credit and so on in her community. And she became a climate-wise woman. And I watched her in Copenhagen sitting with Constance O'Kellan from Uganda, the person I spoke about a lot earlier, a tall woman. She was also a climate-wise woman. And they compared notes. An American woman and a village woman from Uganda compared notes about being absolutely poor, having nothing. And I remember Constance called her Mississippi girl. The other story in the United States is from Alaska. Another extraordinary woman, Patricia Cochran. She's a scientist and a native Alaskan, and she's been observing over a long number of years now the erosion, the sea level rise, the houses that fall into the water, and that now villages have to move. But to move a village, you need to keep the village moving while you build the other village. It's very expensive, and even in the great United States, there's no money for this apparently. So, these are the real live problems that people face. And there are, let me just briefly touch on two good men, in case people think I'm, one of them I did talk about, Anote Tom, who was the former president of Kiribati. When he came to Copenhagen, and it was a bad result, and there was no agreement about the importance of staying at 1.5 degrees, he went back to his people and told them they had no future. He decided to buy land in Fiji, spent $6 million at that time to buy that land, so that his people, I think, could migrate with dignity when the time came. And then he got angry and he decided to fight back, and he was part of the fight back towards Paris that got the new goal and the new interpretation of the scientists that we all need to stay at 1.5 degrees. The other man is the story of just transition. A miner, Jim King, in Canada. He was a union organizer in his mine in New Brunswick. He knew the mine was going to have to close. They'd been told this. And his job was to delay the closure as long as possible and to get as much of a just transition, as much money into the community to compensate, into the workers, training, retraining, etc. And he worked very hard and did his best. And when the mine closed, the whole town was devastated. And he got a job on the other side of Canada in the tar mines, what do you call it, tar sands. And he got better pay, but it didn't really, and he's now a union worker in the tar sands, knowing that they have to stop too, and knowing that he has to work for a just transition, and having the experience, no matter what he did before, it wasn't enough, that he has to fight it now. But he came to Paris before, for the Paris Climate Agreement. I think it was Sharon Burrow invited him to come as a union representative, and he sat in a hall where there was talk about we need to move out of coal, and coal is bad, and coal workers were being just dismissed. And he stood up and he said, I'm a miner. I would love to see a world of clean energy. I don't like going down mines myself. It would be great if we could, but we can't do it without, and he got a standing ovation. And that meant a lot to him. But these are the voices we have to have in the room in order that people think in terms of fairness and justice, in the way we have to make transformative change. We are in a crisis. It's not business as usual. We have to change very dramatically, and we have to do it in the next 10 years, particularly to get on course for a safe world for our children and grandchildren. And therefore, we need to hear the voices of those who are the experts, because they have the frontline experience.
Well, now I'm going to turn to some questions that were asked by the audience. This one is a good segue from your remarks just now. You mentioned that governments need to be squeezed. How can we effectively squeeze the necessary governments back?
Yeah, that's a question that I'm glad has been asked, because I don't really have a good enough answer for it, to be honest. I'm seeing that because President Trump has decided to pull the United States out, China is less engaged, Brazil is doing what Brazil is doing under its bad president too, and Australia, despite bushfires that have devastated that continent, has not decided to move in the way that it should. So we need more squeezing. We need a bigger climate justice movement, and we in particular need the investment, the voices of investors and business to speak up. I mean, the B team of business leaders is now speaking to these governments, and governments listen to the voice of business. The trouble is there's not enough business. There is a bigger catchment of we mean business, about 800 businesses that are represented in the climate discussions. They've all made the commitment to be zero carbon by 2050. We need every country, every city, every corporation to commit to be zero carbon by 2050, at least. Actually, the B team are now saying some of them are moving to 2040, because 2050 is not sufficiently giving leadership. But if we can get that across the board in this year, 2020, in the nationally determined contributions, there's been a mess about who's going to chair the COP in Glasgow, et cetera, et cetera. We have a good thing happening this year. We also have the Biodiversity Convention in China, which I hope will take place despite the coronavirus, that problem. Hopefully that will, run its course. But it is extraordinarily important that we link the climate issue with the biodiversity loss. I mean, there was a report last May that where we face a possible extinction of 1 million species and biodiversity loss. That's also very important. We've had reports on land use, reports on oceans. Every report, January was the hottest month ever in the time space a month ago. It's all happening sooner, and therefore we need that squeeze. But that's up to us. The scientists told us it's doable if you have the political will. So we've got to get the political will.
This next question reads like it was written by me, but it wasn't really. It was one of your questions. Given the climate crisis, what should leading Catholic universities, and I would say universities in general, be doing in research, sustainability, economics, etc.? What advice would you give?
Well, there's a good lead from Pope Francis. The very fact that he brought out Laudato Si before Paris was extraordinarily important, and that he's convening a lot. I mean, he's doing another convening, I think, in the States, in Indiana, this year, of the oil and gas, and I'm hoping to be there. partly to again see where we are. I've seen the BP have made some kind of decision of making a transition, and Shell are thinking about it. But so far, the clean energy that the oil and gas companies have committed to is a very small proportion, and they talk about it. I mean, I've heard ExxonMobil spend more on publicizing what they're doing on algae than the research they're doing. You know, it's talk, rather than actual research. But I think Catholic universities can take their cue from the Pope that you know, this is a crisis. He lays it out very well in Laudato Si, except for one thing, which I was critical of, including to his face. We had a meeting with the elders, and I said to him then what I'd said at a conference in the Vatican shortly after Laudato Si came out. You know, Laudato Si, care for our common home. And the only thing that is not really set out in that encyclical is the role of women in caring for the common home. Women at grassroots level, the women in the book, that's completely missed. And he kind of admitted it, you know. He didn't rewrite his encyclical, but...
The church has a lot of work to do on women. Speaking of women, there was a banner at the 2016 Women's March in Washington, D.C., which read, "When you live a life of privilege, equality feels like injustice." And people fear injustice. How do we embolden the fortunate to achieve equality?
Yeah, I think it's a good, deeply thought through point. I think we are afraid to have a world of real fairness. Somehow we kind of have the fear of what it might mean in terms of, will I have to pay more taxes? Will my property go down if I have new neighbours that, you know, are part of social housing? All of these things, they are deeply entrenched. Just as racism is much more endemic than we'd like to admit. I've been very impressed. I had the privilege of moderating at COP25 in Madrid in December. 5 young people, and young means 13, 14, 15, 16, they were young, and 5 government ministers who were progressive from countries. Sorry. They kind of signed a declaration to do with particular regard for children in the climate space. Anyway, the children were asking questions, and then there was a 13-year-old Norwegian who didn't get the right answer. I could see from her face that she wanted to come back. And she came back and she said, you see, you have to understand, she was addressing the audience at this stage, we are bonded together now by an awareness that we may not have a future. That's bonded us together all over the world. Children all over the world are bonded together. And what we recognize is that we're the lucky ones. She was Norwegian. And we care very much, and we care with love, she said, about those who are in the front line of having their houses, their livelihoods, their communities destroyed by fire, by flood, by rising sea levels, etc. And it was very, very impressive. You know, it was almost saying, we children are in a different space now. We're bonded together by this sense that we may not, all of us may not have a future. But what we care most about is those that are in front line, the canaries that are being hit already. It was very remarkable, you know. And if more of us could think in terms of that solidarity, we'd have a better world.
I'm going to follow up that question, taking my liberty as moderator. We see this with migration right now. How do we change that? Do we need a different legal framework to address this? Because when you talked about the emerging right to migrate if you are displaced by climate change, one of the great challenges is that climate change exacerbates other problems. It's not a problem in and of itself. It could be almost next to impossible to prove that someone has left their home because of climate change, which suggests we need to address the issue more broadly, and that is a more welcoming approach to migrants and refugees from elsewhere in the world. How do we get there?
Well, the elders have been extraordinarily concerned about the migrant issue. We've gone to Sicily in southern Italy. Several of us, Kofi Annan led us there when he was chair. We've talked about it at every context, and it's not getting better in Europe either. And what's happening now in Idlib and other parts of Syria may generate another influx. And actually, we're not dealing with it with the right narrative. The narrative of the positive impact that migrants make. Irish people, above all else, any other nationality, should talk that talk as never before, because we're very proud of the fact, we talk a lot about the difference we made in this country, and the Irish Americans. Migrants tend to be those who are determined to try and make a new life and have the drive and often the skills to do it, and yet they're not welcome. And it's a real tragedy, and I think that the separation, obviously, of parents and children is terrible. But we do need a new narrative, and we need it quickly. We need to manage migration much better in every country and globally, because, sadly, we're going to see much more of it, because the main driver, increasingly, is going to be the climate crisis. It's just an inevitable reality.
We still have time? One more, okay. This one is a very interesting one. I've had a number of friends in their 60s and 70s comment that they are glad the youth are taking over the responsibility
For fixing the climate crisis, since our generation has made such a mess of it. What is the best way to convince these friends that they can't leave all the work to the youth?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's a question with a lot in it, because there is a tendency to load children with too much responsibility. And that's something that Greta said, you've stolen my childhood. What the children are actually saying is, don't listen to us as children for the solutions. Listen to the science. Over and over again, that's what Greta says, that's what the children are saying. Listen to the science. That's why I'm so glad to be here at the AAAS meeting, because it's the science that is, and it's the science linked with what we're doing to nature that is the key. But we cannot leave it in that sense. We can admit that we have not done enough, that we've made pretty much of a mess of it, but that we also must have more responsibility. I think I like the intergenerational. I mean, I liked it on that march, that I had a sense that we were the angry grannies and granddads, I hope, and then the children. It's that intergenerational approach which will help to put squeeze on governments, because we need the wisdom of those who lived through things and even admitted mistakes, admitted we haven't done enough to help the children. But I have to say that truth to power voice of the children, with their sense of intergenerational injustice, has been enormously helpful to climate justice, because it has helped to open up, as I said, the other injustices. The fact that developing countries are faced with large growing populations and the need to develop and provide the livelihoods and the future for their people, and that we have to do far more, including in transfer of technology and investment of skills in clean energy to those countries. So we need the energies of both, as I said at the beginning, it's all of us. The first step is everybody has to recognize and try and do what we can, and then go on from there to be disruptive of those who aren't doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, for your fabulous responses to my questions and the audience questions. We can give a hand.
Gurb Mina Mahakuk, Moira August Carmen, Giv, Good Ushel, August Corj Galair, Fidelma Fion is Anna Blum. So thank you very much, Mary, and to Carmen. And hello, friends and distinguished guests today. It's wonderful to have you all with us. My name is Fidelma McGinn, and I'm just so thrilled that you all came and joined us this morning to have this presentation with the Honourable Mary Robinson. So let's give both speakers a round of applause again.
Before we finish, I don't think I've done enough speak a little Irish myself, so let me share a wonderful Irish proverb with you. I'll say it first in Irish and then I'll translate it because it's very relevant. It's our Scott Hela of Warren Nadini. It's in each other's shadow that we flourish. It's worth thinking about. You know, it's in each other's shadow that we flourish. That solidarity that is actually going to be the opportunity of the climate crisis. Sorry.
Not at all, Mary. You can always have the floor. I'd like to also just extend Gurb Mila Mahaviv, our sincere thanks to our guests, our hosts, in fact, Grace Wan and her team here at K&L Gates for offering us the use of this space this morning. So thanks again. And great to see all the work that you're doing here in the law practice. So thanks for continuing to champion it. And also, of course, to our great colleagues and partners, Global Washington, to Christine Daly and her fabulous crew, who partnered with us not just on this event, but last night we had another event. So we've really been working very, very much here in her short visit with us to the Emerald City, which also is the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people that I want to recognize, including the Duwamish tribe, who are here resident on these ancestral lands and are thriving and continue to share their community with us here today. You know, yes, Kristen said I am a member of the Irish diaspora. Many of you also here today. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Really nice to have such good company. I'd like to also recognize that yesterday we did have a chance to meet with Mayor Durkin, and she declared February 13th Mary Robinson Day. There is, as you well know, as governments like to do, there's a lot of policy speak in certain documents, but this proclamation really does cite all the fabulous things that Mary has achieved in her career. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll skip the jargon and just share with you some of the main accomplishments. This city of Seattle proclaims, whereas Mary Robinson served as the 7th President of Ireland, becoming the first woman to hold that office. And she served as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, where she was recognized as a passionate, forceful advocate for gender equality, women's participation in peace building, human dignity. And she has served as Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. And, while she was not too busy, she founded the non-governmental organization Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, whose central concerns include equitable international trade, access to healthcare, migration, women's leadership, corporate responsibility. And she's currently the chair of the Council of Elders, founded by Nelson Mandela as an independent global group of leaders working together for peace and human rights. She was a founding member of the Council of Women World Leaders, served as honorary president of Oxfam International, and was a member of the Club of Madrid, which promotes democracy worldwide. And she was the recipient of numerous awards, including Amnesty International's Ambassador of Conscience Award and the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. And hereby, I'm going to act as Mayor Jenny Durkin for a second. She is in Seattle from February 13th through the 15th, discussing her commitment to tackling the climate crisis and advocating for those most vulnerable. Mayor of Seattle proclaims February 13th to be Mary Robinson Day. And it's wonderful, we'll celebrate every And next time we'll make sure the Space Needle glows green, I think, or do something else. I'll willingly admit that I've been possessed, obsessed, impressed by Mrs. Robinson since she took up office as the first female president in 1990. I was a little older than Robert, but still impressionable. She shattered the shackles of a patriarchal system and led a small island nation in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean towards a sea change in social, political, and economic advancements. And she didn't stop there. As I noted in all those proclamations, she blazed a trail for us young, impressionable minds and gave us the audacity to dream that we could do anything we set our mind to. And she kept the lights on in our son of Grog. So some of us sought out new adventures abroad, and that light burned brightly, and we're really very thankful. We have a long-standing tradition and partnership with Ireland. In fact, Seattle is the sister city to Galway. Do we have any Galwegians in the crowd? One! Oh my gosh! Only one, I'm surprised. This year, Galway will play host to the European Capital of Culture, and I am super excited to share with you that we have amazing artists here in our region. But specifically, I want to recognize 2 Seattle-based artists who will be representing us. Glass artist Paula Stokes, I think, is here with us today. homage to the potato famine that plagued Ireland between 1845 and 1849. And so she will be showcasing that work in Strokestown and County Roscommon, and also in Wexford, Waterford, one other county, and Galway. And also Rosario Lynch, a photographer who's based in Seattle and Tacoma, will also be showcasing her photography. So if you're going to Ireland at all over the summer, please be sure to check out what's going on. There's many of us who can help you with an itinerary if you're looking for ideas. But now we'll conclude the formal program, and we'll invite you all to, it's a full house today, so I'd like you to have an orderly line here, please, if you'd like to get your book autographed. Mary's very graciously giving her time to spend some time with you here, and whenever you're ready, Mary, you can make your way over. Please do be mindful, though, that there is a large crowd here, and we have to move Mary on to our next engagement. So if you could, please keep your conversation succinct. And I'll just tell you up front, no, she cannot help you with renewing your Irish passport or finding out about your Irish ancestors, okay? So with that, we'll start a line over here. If everybody has a book, if you didn't get one on the way in, we can help you. And if you could have it open on the page you'd like autographed and the name of the person you'd like it inscribed to. And there ended my instructions. Gurmila Mahagud Blair.